The ocean was not a friend. It was a bottomless void, a furnace of humidity and salt that promised to consume anything that dared float upon it. On July 2nd, 1937, that void waited. It was 2043 Howland time, but up there, in the cramped cockpit of the Lockheed Electra 10E, the darkness was absolute and the panic was slow, chemical. Amelia Earhart, the most celebrated aviator of her generation, had miscalculated. The navigator, Fred Noonan, a man who trusted the stars, could see nothing beyond heavy clouds and the faint reflection of the instrument panel lights on his gloves. The radio was alive, but it was a life of static and frustration. They were on their way to Howland Island, a tiny, almost theoretical point in the middle of the Central Pacific. The fuel was running out. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter, the Itasca, was on station near Howland, its radio operators desperate. They could hear the high-pitched, nervous sound of the Electra. They knew Earhart could hear them, but due to some catastrophic equipment or frequency failure, she could not determine the ship's position or receive its critical instructions. It was a dance of death of unilateral communication, where one side shouted warnings while the other drowned in silence just a few hundred kilometers away. The official account, the one the White House hurried to accept and disseminate, was simple: communication failure, fuel exhaustion, fatal accident west of Howland Island. A heroic tragedy. But the Itasca had records. There were civilian and military radio operators scattered across the Pacific Islands who swore they captured faint signals from the Electra days, perhaps weeks, after the official disappearance date. They were distress calls, broken, distorted by salt and distance, but unmistakable. The voices spoke of water, injuries, and the need for help. This was not the sound of a submerged aircraft. It was the sound of a forced landing. This leads us to Nikumaroro Island, then known as Gardner Island, an uninhabited atoll 640 kilometers southeast of Howland. The environment was a tropical cauldron with dense low-lying vegetation. It was here, decades later, that investigators found artifacts that simply should not exist. Pieces of plexiglass that exactly matched the model of the Electra 10ES window, parts of cosmetics from the 1930s, and most sinister of all, bone fragments found in 1940. These bones were initially examined by a doctor in the Fiji Islands, who concluded they belonged to a tall, stocky male. The verdict was rejected, and the bones were lost. But in 1998, a new analysis by forensic experts using the original measurements suggested something radically different. The bone morphology, especially the femur and cranial structure, was consistent with that of a woman of European descent, specifically a woman with the height and skeletal build of Amelia Earhart. Her body, and perhaps Noonan's, could have reached Nikumaroro, but how? The flight route was direct, but the Pacific Ocean in 1937 was a chessboard of rapidly escalating politics. Imperial Japan was consolidating its presence in Micronesia, aggressively expanding its territories. The Marshall Islands and the Caroline Islands were under Japanese control and were restricted zones. Earhart's flight, sponsored by America and equipped with some of the most advanced communication equipment of the time, dangerously overflew these areas. The spy theory, considered wild for years, begins to gain weight under the burden of untold evidence. Earhart, being the public figure she was, could have been the perfect facade for a photographic reconnaissance mission over Japanese fortifications. If she and Noonan veered south, by error or by secret design, and were forced to land on Japanese-held territory, their fate would cease to be an accident and become an international incident of explosive proportions. The State Department in Washington acted with questionable speed to close the case. The searches, vast and expensive, were concentrated in an area where they knew, from unofficial radio reports, the Electra probably wasn't. The Roosevelt administration had a supreme interest in avoiding any direct confrontation. With Tokyo in 1937, the silence about the possibility of Earhart being captured and detained by Japanese forces on Saipan Island, where testimonies later placed her, was not a communication error. It was a deliberate policy of secrecy. The archive mind now investigates the web of diplomatic intrigue and the silenced forensic traces. The question remains, dark and cold as the deep sea. Did Amelia Earhart die in an accident? Or was she silenced by a war the world was not yet ready to acknowledge? The silence of the deep Pacific Ocean is a lie. It is not the silence of absence, but the silence imposed. The weight of classified information that sank deeper than any aircraft wreckage. To understand the real fate, one must follow not the trail of debris, but the trail of diplomatic smoke that emanated from Saipan. Saipan in 1937 was the military jewel of Japanese Micronesia, a crucial and heavily fortified base that Japan swore it was not militarizing. American aviation overflying the area was a provocation that imperial leaders could not tolerate. When American forces finally took Saipan in 1944 at the height of the Pacific War, the true archive of Japanese secrets began to emerge piece by piece, often from the mouths of natives and former prisoners, who had remained silent for years under the threat of execution. The testimonies, consistent in their core, pointed to the detention of 2 white Americans, a tall, aging man, and a woman, recognizable by her distinct features and short hair, held in custody in Garapan, the island's administrative capital. The accounts described the Electra aircraft not as a submerged pile of metal, but as a machine meticulously inspected by Japanese naval engineers. Earhart's aircraft was equipped with state-of-the-art navigation, a Bendix radio direction finder, and an impressive array of K3B cameras that, though intended to document the globe, had the potential to map coastal fortifications and secret landing strips. For Tokyo, the Electra was not a lost aircraft, it was a treasure trove of technical intelligence. The fate of Earhart and Noonan would have been sealed the moment they landed on some Japanese-controlled atoll, forced to do so by lack of fuel or the threat of interceptors. The theory that they were executed as spies, or that they died under Japanese custody during the years of internment before the war, is supported by the fact that Washington never demanded a transparent investigation into their whereabouts on Saipan, even after the 1945 victory. The U.S. Navy, aware of the risks of an international crisis, mounted a massive and visible search operation, led by the aircraft carrier USS Lexington, but the scope of that search was encoded. Instead of following the intercepted radio signals that placed the Electra dangerously close to the Marshall Islands, the operation was methodically directed south and east, away from Japanese territory. This was a staged display of mourning and diligence, designed for public consumption. While the Office of Naval Intelligence only handled the case as a national security incident, the official story is an echo chamber, repeating the narrative of disappearance at sea for over 8 decades. Yet, in 1961, a retired U.S. Air Force colonel, Joseph H. Vase, obtained an internal U.S. Navy document alleging that Earhart and Noonan were alive and detained on Saipan for a time, although the document was quickly declassified and subsequently denied. Its brief existence suggests the knowledge was present within government ranks. The coldest piece of the puzzle is the absence of unequivocal human remains. If Earhart had died in a crash at sea, we would expect at least a fragmented trail of the Electra. However, the absence of substantial wreckage at the official search site and the persistence of reports of her imprisonment force us to contemplate a scenario where the plane was confiscated and removed, perhaps dismantled, by the Japanese to study its advanced radio and navigation technology. The archive mind examines photographs that circulate sporadically, blurred and of uncertain origin, allegedly showing Earhart and Noonan under the watch of Japanese soldiers. While the authenticity of these images is always contested, the narrative they carry, of a secret mission that ended not in accidental tragedy, but in capture and political silencing, remains the darkest ghost of American aviation. We no longer search for bones in the sand. We search for ink on long-buried documents. Amelia Earhart's fate is intrinsically linked to the first bullet fired in the war Washington was desperately trying to avoid. She was not lost. She was taken. The premise of capture leads us immediately to the nerve center of Pacific geopolitics. In 1937, Japan operated what was euphemistically called the South Seas Mandate, a vast archipelago of Micronesian islands that functioned as secret military bases. Saipan, the administrative and strategic center of the Nanyo Mandate, was an airtight fortress. Its existence, filled with airstrips and fortifications that blatantly violated international naval disarmament agreements, was an open secret that Washington could not publicly confront without precipitating a war. Earhart's aircraft, the Lockheed Electra 10E, was not just a long-range civilian plane. It was a test platform, equipped with the most sophisticated radio and directional navigation equipment of the time. The espionage theory suggests that its route, especially its proximity to Jalowit and Mili Atoll lands, the Japanese were rapidly transforming into advanced air bases, was not a coincidence. American Naval Intelligence, the ONI, would have been interested in obtaining visual confirmation of these activities, and who better to overfly forbidden waters than the world's most famous aviator, whose presence could be easily justified as a navigational error. The last significant radio signal from the Electra, captured by the Coast Guard cutter Itasca near Howland Island, occurred at 8:43 in the morning, Howland time, on July 2, 1937, but scattered reports of distant, fragmentary radio transmissions continued for days. These transmissions, supposedly coming from an unusual Japanese frequency, were quickly dismissed as radio ghosts, atmospheric interference. Yet they paint a different picture, a forced or controlled landing in shallow waters, the aircraft being towed, and Earhart's desperate attempt to send a signal under duress, or in a more macabre scenario, the staged repetition of messages by her captors seeking to confuse the trail. Decades after the incident, the archive mind turns to unwritten reports and oral testimony. On Saipan and Tinian, members of the local Chamorro community and former American prisoners of war, liberated after 1944, reported seeing or hearing about the white woman and the man detained by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, shortly after 1937. These accounts, often dismissed as war folklore, describe Noonan, the navigator, summarily executed, and Earhart, kept alive for interrogation because of her fame and the information she potentially carried about American range capabilities and technology. Some accounts even detail the location of her confinement, a small stone cell near the former Japanese barracks in Garapan. The official US Navy history required that the Lockheed Electra and its occupants had plunged to an abyssal depth, eliminating any physical trace. This narrative served a dual purpose. It preserved American honor by not admitting that their heroine had been captured by an enemy power, and more crucially, it prevented Japan from claiming that Earhart's flight was an act of espionage, which would have served as a convenient casus belli for Tokyo. The truth, therefore, is buried not under the ocean, but under the Washington Convention and the policy of not intervention. The fate of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan was silenced by the fear of escalation. They became the first undeclared casualties in the Pacific Theater, martyrs of pre-war espionage. Their airplane, the Electra, would have been dismantled piece by piece, its radio systems meticulously studied by Japanese naval engineers. In 1944, when American forces finally took Saipan in one of the bloodiest battles of World War II, attention was focused on victory, not on espionage relics. Any document, any bone, any evidence of captivity would have been quickly incinerated or categorized under the heading of top national security. Buried in archives the sun will never see, we search for the Lockheed Electra at the bottom of the sea. But we should search for it in the technical drawings that helped build the Japanese war machine. It was not swallowed by the Pacific, it was absorbed by the war. The physical trail, even amid the carnage of the taking of Saipan in 1944, did not vanish instantly. Local witnesses and US Marine veterans reported under oath, decades later, the existence of incongruous artifacts: a tube of toothpaste manufactured in California, a small, non-standard navigation telescope from the Imperial Japanese Navy, and what appeared to be a long human bone of female build, found in the rubble of an old Kempeitai prison in Garapan, where the heat of battle had left the pavement with a patina of blood and limestone. These reports, often confined to footnotes of low-level intelligence reports, met with bureaucratic silence. The War Department, overwhelmed with the logistics of victory and the transition to the Cold War, treated the search for Amelia Earhart not as a missing persons investigation, but as a counterintelligence issue. The risk was not the discovery of their remains, but the confirmation that Washington had lied about the nature of her 1937 flight. Noonan and Earhart fell directly into the cauldron of tensions that preceded Pearl Harbor. The final planned route, with its emphasis on overflying Japanese-controlled Marshall Islands, was of incalculable military interest to both sides. The Japanese were secretly building large air and naval bases in direct contravention of the Washington Naval Treaties of 1922. Knowledge that one of America's most famous figures was mapping these movements was explosive. Forensic details from the time, though not officially confirmed, suggest that the Electra, an S-2 was not merely scrapped for metal, but for technology. The 550 horsepower Pratt & Whitney Wasp S3H1 engines, and especially the Bendix radio system, were cut. Japanese engineers, desperate to extend the range of their own naval bombers and intercept increasing American transmissions, would have studied every wire. The fate of the fuselage remains, according to unverified testimonies from Saipan civilian workers, was to fill trenches and sanitary ditches, mixed with rubble. There was no honor of a shipwreck. The Lockheed Electra was simply turned into war infrastructure. Decades later, archaeology focused on Nikumaroro, an uninhabited island, under the non-conspiratorial forced landing theory. funded and promoted by foundations that seemed eager to maintain the heroic spy-free narrative. Meanwhile, in Maryland and Virginia, classified archives of the Office of Naval Intelligence and the early CIA contained transcripts of Japanese prisoners of war who had vaguely mentioned a woman pilot and the man who navigated detained in Saipan. These documents were routinely dismissed as stress interrogations or propaganda, despite internal consistency across several separate accounts. The psychology of denial was powerful. Admitting that Amelia Earhart had been a spy, or at least an involuntary reconnaissance agent, would have forced the recognition that America was actively provoking Tokyo years before the attack on Pearl Harbor. That would tarnish the myth of American innocence in entering the war. The sacrifice of Earhart and Noonan, thus, had to remain a tragic accident, a fatal navigation error, a sea mystery, and not a political murder under enemy custody. Noonan's body, according to the same line of scattered testimonies, would have had a quicker fate, summary execution as a male war spy. Earhart, however, represented greater propaganda and intelligence value. A chess piece to be interrogated to the point of exhaustion. The idea that she might have endured months of confinement, isolated, before succumbing to illness or brutality, is a psychological burden American historiography preferred to avoid. Amelia Earhart's true resting place is not the abyssal depth of the Pacific Ocean, but the even greater depth of the secret archive, sealed by 7 decades of national security. Her mystery is not about where she crashed, but why the truth about her captivity was considered more dangerous for America than her loss. They were not martyrs of aviation. They became necessary ghosts to protect a foreign policy of secrecy and non-confrontation until the hour of confrontation was inevitable. The island of Saipan in 1937 was not a tropical paradise under Japanese civilian administration. It was an expanding military fortification, part of the South Seas Mandate, under the aegis of the Gun, the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Garapon district, mentioned in scattered reports, housed the administrative headquarters and a detention center that was not on tourist routes. It was to this geographic and legal limbo that Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan would have been taken after a forced landing or capture near the Marshall Islands or the Jalawat Reef Barrier to the east. The radio silence that followed the last desperate call of KHIQQ on July 2, 1937, was not merely the result of dead batteries or bad weather, it was the harbinger of an intervention. The aircraft, the Lockheed Electra 10E, was a reconnaissance machine disguised as a world record vehicle. Its range capability and long-course radio equipment were of vital interest to Japanese Naval Intelligence, which was secretly turning the mandated islands into forward bases. The initial interrogation would not have focused on lost flight routes, but on the depth of American information about the growing Japanese military presence. The details about Earhart's life in captivity are fragmentary, obtained years later from witnesses who survived the hell of the Battle of Saipan in 1944. There were accounts from the native Chamorros who served the Japanese administration, and from former Korean or Chinese prisoners of war used as labor. These accounts, often contradictory in dates but consistent in the core, described the presence of a tall white woman, dressed in a flight suit, and a stocky man, detained under heavy surveillance in the Garapon area. Noonan's fate, as predicted, was likely sealed within days. A militarily trained navigator, his utility after extracting coordinates and technical details from the aircraft was limited. Beheading or summary execution by firing squad as a war spy was Japanese protocol. His body, like that of the airplane, would have been summarily incinerated or buried in unmarked graves, routine on isolated military bases that did not expect external inspection. Earhart survived for a more complex reason: her value as a hostage and symbol. American pressure for her return, though officially masked as a rescue search, would have been intense in diplomatic backchannels. Japan, still trying to avoid an open war in 1937, could have used her detention as a bargaining chip, or more likely as a continuous source of intelligence under the premise that her fame might induce more details about Washington's objectives. The date of her death is a point of contention among post-war reports. Some testimonies point to the latter half of 1937. Others indicate she may have survived until late 1938, succumbing to dysentery, malnutrition, or, the darkest scenario, physical interrogation that exceeded the limit of human survival. In 1944, when the US Marines took Saipan, apocryphal reports emerged of soldiers finding traces of an isolated grave containing skeletal remains matching the build of a Western woman. These finds, however, were never formally recorded or preserved with the necessary forensic rigor in the chaotic atmosphere of an invasion. The priority was not criminal archaeology, but victory. The official American denial served a dual and lasting purpose. First, it perpetuated the image of Earhart as a pioneer who failed heroically in the name of progress, a narrative more palatable than that of a sacrificed reconnaissance agent. Second, and more crucially, by insisting the Electra simply got lost at sea, America could credibly argue it had no prior knowledge or intention of monitoring the secret Japanese fortifications in the mandated Pacific. Accepting the truth would have been a tacit admission that Washington was violating international agreements and that Japan had legitimate reasons, from its point of view, to consider the crew as captured war spies in militarily sensitive territory. The mystery of Earhart's crash ensured the political silence that extended into the modern era, an involuntary and tragic tribute to the coldness of national security. The real cemetery is the desert of classified papers. The denial, cold and polished, left Fred Noonan, the navigator, in a category of even deeper oblivion. If Earhart was the public relations flag, Noonan was the data repository, the mind that knew precisely which coordinates were being checked and why the deviation from the original route was necessary. His experience as a former Pan-American navigator on the Pacific route implied intimate knowledge of weather patterns and the islands under Japanese mandate. Noonan had no propaganda value, only strategic value. His fate, therefore, is almost certainly quicker and more brutal. Internal Japanese reports, if they existed, were purged with the lethal precision that characterized the imperial security structure, especially those related to the Navy Defense Unit based in Saipan and Kwajalein. Japan, operating under the League of Nations mandate, was blatantly violating international agreements by fortifying the islands, turning them into militarized gateways for what would become the Pacific War. The presence of Earhart and Noonan, regardless of their official mission, provided the Imperial Navy with the perfect justification to reinforce the doctrine of absolute security around the Nanyo-Guntu, the mandated area. The capture of the aircraft, the Lockheed Electra 10E, registration NR16020, would have been an invaluable intelligence trophy. The aircraft was not just a vehicle, it was an advanced communication platform for its time. The 50-watt Bendix radio transmitter and long-range antenna, designed for transoceanic navigation, would have been dissected by Japanese naval engineers, revealing range and frequency capabilities that could compromise future American cryptography and communications. The destruction or concealment of the aircraft's physical remains became as crucial to Tokyo as Washington's silence. If the Electra had been forced to land on any of the fortified atolls or even Saipan, material evidence of a modern American aircraft in militarily sensitive territory would have been explosive. Any recovered metal fragment not consistent with a casual maritime accident would be proof of American presence and, by extension, espionage. This is the core of the forensic mystery, the persistent absence of irrefutable wreckage in the ocean depths or on land. Contemporary researchers, armed with high-resolution, side-scan, sonar technology and remotely operated underwater vehicles ROVs, have meticulously combed the areas around Howland Island, seeking the unmistakable silhouette of the Electra's twin tail. The seabed in this region reaches abyssal depths, exceeding 4,000 meters, a cold, anoxic environment that, ironically, could have preserved the fuselage. The absence of a massive, identifiable impact suggests two equally disturbing scenarios. Either the aircraft disintegrated into small fragments scattered over a vast area, or it never crashed in the water near Howland. The persistence of the capture and detention scenario is fueled by testimonies from former island residents and war veterans who could only speak openly. After the end of the American occupation of Saipan, stories of a white woman and her companion in custody, often transported in secrecy between the islands, circulated in whispers. While the credibility of these accounts varies, the recurring pattern of imprisonment and death from dysentery or maltreatment, in one of the Navy's temporary prisons on Saipan or in the Kawagishi camp, adds weight to the darker scenario. The Japanese bureaucracy, obsessive about records, would have kept some kind of file. But the order for the destruction of crucial documents at the end of the war was comprehensive and effective, eliminating the written evidence of the crime. The final tragedy is not just the death, but the obliteration of the truth by two great powers. Washington sacrificed the memory of 2 citizens to maintain its credible diplomatic denial. Tokyo executed the spies and erased the evidence to protect its secret military infrastructure. The price of national security, in this case, was historical truth. Earhart became an empty icon, a legend hovering on the surface, while the dark reality sank, silently, into the swamp of state secrecy. The Electra, whether it lies at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean or was dismantled in a Japanese hangar, is the ghost of a war yet to come, and the cemetery is a sea of lies.